Hi, Todd.
Hey, Julie.
So I invited you to talk about Death Drive again, and I think we were talking about Death Drive almost 3 years ago.
I think it's that long. Yeah.
So maybe it could be a good tradition to talk about it, or repetition compulsion.
Yeah. I mean, it would fit in with the concept for sure.
And you're the rare person who actually likes it, the concept of the Death Drive, and I like it too. So let's maybe start from scratch and define death drive in psychoanalysis. Maybe the way it would be defined was in Freudian psychoanalysis, Lacanian, and maybe at Spielreinian this time.
Okay. Good. Well, I think you would be more of the expert to add Spilranian for than me, right? But I can definitely talk about her. Um, yeah. So for Freud, I, let's just start from the beginning. So in 1920, uh, he writes Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and he has come up with the idea of the death drive, but he wants to lay out how he came to it. And so, interestingly, he talks about instances of repetition that don't follow the pleasure principle. So for him, that so the pleasure principle for him is the that we're impelled to find ways to release excess excitation or stimulation, which is a little bit of a contrary way to think about pleasure, but that's how Freud defines pleasure. And then he he discovers these instances where people actually increase their excitation and privilege that over the release of it and privilege things that are repeat events or experiences that are damaging to them or even traumatic to them. So he then that's what leads him to this idea that there's this drive in us, which he thinks at the end of the book, he says it. He goes, I think I have to conclude that the death drive, the pleasure principle serves the death drive. So that's how it leads him to come up with this idea of death drive. And I think some people wrongly understand it as linked to what he in Civilization's Discontents calls the nirvana principle. That is this idea of going down to like going down to zero. And I think the problem is that Freud himself in Beyond the Pleasure Principle talks a little bit about biological entities, and then and he flirts with the idea that maybe the death drive is a drive to return to the inorganic. And so a lot of people that are Freudian think, oh, the death drive is this drive to return to the inorganic. And so that Freud himself, I don't think thinks that. I think he thinks it's this um, this way that we're drawn to what's traumatic for us, or that we're it's a name for what for our self-destructiveness. So I think that's the. Does that seem to coincide with how you see the Freudian picture?
We would normally, I see Freudian in a way that the way he tries to define it, it's contradictory, and precisely because he struggles with it, that what makes it so interesting, because he's including it, struggling with it, and it creates a space where you can add something else, because he basically provides contradictory options of how to interpret it. But with Lacan is even worse. It's getting
It's
even.
even worse. Right, right. That's true. I mean, so I think you're right that Freud gives a lot of like even beyond the pleasure principle is like some of the things he says are contradictory. I do think one of the things that I really love about that book is that he uh, tries to chronicle his own path toward coming up with the idea. And so I think most people write a book. I mean, everybody writes a book after they've already come up with the idea, and then they just defend the idea. And he's trying to say, this is how I got to this point. So I do like that. But then I think you're right that even in later books, he seems to say he seems to at times equate death drive with aggressiveness, and I think that that's wrong. But I kind of like what you're saying that he's struggling himself, and he depicts that struggle, and he gives people a chance to take up their own position relative to it. And then you said Lacan is worse, and it's true. So early on, Lacan in the very early seminars, he he links death drive to the functioning of the symbolic order. Just that's it. The death drive is how the symbolic functions, and that symbolic repetition is the repetition of the death drive. And then in seminar 7, he undergoes this incredible revolution. This is the seminar, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. And he says, well, he doesn't say that I was wrong before. He never does that. But he starts to think that he thinks about death drive in terms of the Marquis de Sade and this idea of a, 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 a death that wipes everything out. So like a second, and he comes up with this idea of the position between two deaths, and death drive is somehow linked to that, although it's not exactly clearly spelled out by him. And then a really radical shift happens after seminar 7, where death drive actually starts to become more like, I think, the way Freud began, and it becomes this repetition of a traumatic real that resists symbolization. So he goes for, it's a really radical, I think, I read it as a really radical shift from this early identification of death drive with symbolic, functioning as symbolic, and then later the death drive becomes what interrupts the symbolic functioning.
So there are different interpretations in Freud, and it gets Lacan struggles, not that he struggles with it, but it's like taking it in different directions. Nonetheless, both agree that it's in certain ways, in different ways, central thing, like the central drive or the prototype of drive of, or for Freud, the pleasure principle, which he used to see as a central principle, now is subordinated to death drive. And for Lacan, is this how every drive work, undermining itself.
Right.
So this strange thing, and for me, if we want to start talking about Sabina Spielrein, is that I think she introduced the whole disturbance of being a woman and just not fitting in, because her concept, which is the concept of the death instinct, but instinct is a problematic, we can call it death drive. Freud acknowledges that he claims that she anticipated, which is not really cool way to say when you're
Right.
stealing someone's concept. But 8 years before she presented her paper, Destruction as a Cause of Coming into Being, and in it she provides, it's a great paper, and I really love her. But Freud, those 8 years, he rejected it first, and those 8 years he was struggling to accept it. Later, he came to accepting it. Maybe he was forced because of his life circumstances or something. But then he is coming back to maybe to rejecting it, like reducing it to something we need to overcome. And psychoanalysis would later also see it, trying to make it central, but also every time tries to include it as central, again, coming back to this idea of overcoming or doing something with it, never struggling to make it actually central, claiming, might be claiming that it's central, but actually failing to see it as central. This is why I love Sabina Spielrein as someone who just would disrupt the whole functioning of
Right.
psychoanalysis forever.
Right, right. I think that's really true. And I think, like, to me, the way that Freud wants to insist on the idea of two drives, the eros and death drive, is his way. And then the way that civilization and its discontents ends with this eternal battle between eros and death drive. And you can see that he's kind of hoping for eros to be victorious. So I think that that really supports your point that there's a sense that um, that Freud is there's a kind of like acknowledgement of the death drive, but still a sense that there has to be a way to overcome it. Not that, and I mean, I think Lacan is a little closer to the position that you're describing at the end, at least like in position of the unconscious. This is one of his écrits. He says there's only one drive, it's the death drive, right? So he does sort of grasp its centrality and not thinking it needs to be overcome. But I maybe, I mean, I think we could probably argue about that. But um, I do like your idea that Sabina Spielrein introduces this thing into psychoanalysis that then uh, other thinkers have tried and can't really fully integrate or wrestle with.
It's also strange how maybe a woman is, there's something in a woman that allows you to comprehend what she was able to comprehend. And maybe man needs to be in a certain age
Yeah, 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 yeah.
to come to it. Like you have to surrender. There's something that you have to surrender to this kind of thought. That this strange thing about you and the way I love you philosophically, in a similar way, I love Sabina Spielrein because you independently from her come to the idea, comprehending of a death drive in a similar way she did, with seeing it as not necessarily individual, but something that defines a society too,
Yeah.
something in between. And this is for me is crucial because all the interpretations of death drive are kind of reducing it to subjective drive. And you, the only person I'm doing it to. I don't love like myself though, but there is something about death drive that is beyond subjectivity, beyond the subject as such. And I think this is what Sabina Spielrein starts with. And Freud, when he makes it a part of psychoanalysis, which is substantially based on the subject, uh, and he loses the until before you, this thread was lost with Sabina Spielrein. So this but in a bit different way because for you she starts with the subject, the woman subject, more the personal bond or woman and a child, and your death drive as something that defines society or social bond is more about society and kind of civilization, but in a different way for Freud, because for Freud, it's already in civilization. It's the death drive would be seen rather than aggression as in opposition to eros, and it precludes, I don't know, something.
Well, it precludes civilization for him, doesn't it? I mean, I think it's the thing that would undermine civilization for him.
And for you, is that something that constitutes rather
Absolutely,
society?
it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. I hadn't thought of myself in that way, but I think I wouldn't disagree with anything you said. Like, I think that's exactly true. That I think, especially because I don't believe in anything called eros. So that's I don't think that there's this opposing drive called eros that I think I mean, obviously I believe in love because the title of the book that we're is love and death. But I think that it's not it's that love emerges out of death drive, right? Like it's not something that's separate or opposed to it. So I think that's really important. And I do think it is the source of the social bond. And that's why I think that that's one reason the social bond is so precarious, right? Like it's constantly it's at odds with itself, I think.
So how would you define it as, let's clarify, how is it,
Yeah.
how it constitutes the social bond?
Well, that I think that that what we're grouped around is some kind of or what we end up identifying with to form a social order is some kind of constitutive loss or trauma. And then that's the trauma that ends up being repeated and navigated. And so that's why I think collectively every society has what's animating it is the death drive. So that's what I would say that there's no just like so I think there's a real parallel between the social structure and individual subjectivity because that individual subjectivity also defined by some traumatic emergence of subjectivity. Same thing with the social bond, and that it's also the thing that holds people together. And that's why if people seem like they haven't shared that trauma, they seem like they're outside of the social order or social bond.
There is something about rituals too and the sacrifice that
Right.
to feel the value, to have to establish a value of something, of anything, one has to sacrifice uh, or articulate in a way the nothingness or lack to establish the value, or basically to establish anything social. Uh,
Well, I think, don't you think that that's true both? That's another thing that's true both individually and socially. Like I think that to establish the value of anything individually, you have to engage in some act of sacrifice. But I think it's true socially as well. To establish any kind of social value, there's some kind of sacrificial ritual requisite. And so I think sometimes these rituals um, are barbaric and sometimes they're sort of anodyne, but I think they have to exist. Like because that form, that's the, it's, and I think you said it really well that through the act of sacrifice, we create something and I think this is what what animates the death drive, actually, that we create something transcendent, that there's nothing that should, otherwise it's just a flat existence that we have. And I think that's unlivable to us. And so I think the act of sacrifice creates something. I mean, I think this is really close to what Sabina Spielrein would say about the relationship between destruction and creation.
Sabina Spielrein would start with her girls, women analyzans who she was analyzing, and she claimed that the way they feel when they're in love is that there's some foreign force in relation to them is robbing them from themselves. So it's against self-interest. It's something that deprives you of you, and this is how love is created. One would say now that it's unhealthy relationship and that you're supposed to be
Right.
those unhealthy relationship, those healthy relationship look like non-relationship at all because there is supposed to be some kind of sacrifice, not necessarily of yourself to other. It might be shared sacrifice, but nonetheless, this loss, kind of, you cannot feel the value without sacrificing something to something, and it can be completely absurd thing, like in religion, for example.
Right, right. I mean, religion is the great example of this like act of sacrifice, and I think that like in a certain way, the more absurd it is, the more powerful the religion is, right? Like that's I think
Mhm.
that's absolutely.
So anything, that's how we know that we love it because we know it's irrational to love it. We know it hurts us. We know it doesn't make sense, but that's precisely because it's against self-interest. There's something destructive in it. That's how it, unfortunately, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, maybe unfortunately, but I do think that I really like that idea that every real love relationship is an unhealthy relationship. I think that's a really good way to think of it because just because of I think I'm really invested in this idea, and I think this has such social implications, right? I'm really invested in this idea that death drive is absolutely opposed to self-interest, that self-interest or the good is what we sacrifice for the sake of the satisfaction of the death drive. And so I feel like there's no such thing. I think you even said like a healthy relationship isn't really a relationship at all, right? Like it's not really, it can't, well, it's not a love relationship.
Which also means on the other side, the really love, the ultimate love relationship is something that destroys you even physically. Like it's so horrible, it cannot exist. It's not that you're in harmony with each other, but it's only loss that remains. And by the way, it was so this month we're talking about death drive, but next month we will probably talk not with you, but the topic is going to be suicide and self-harm. And it's strange how when in psychology who privatized the term suicide or anything suicidal and self-harm, it's like it belongs to them, but in psychoanalysis, of course they would not talk about death drive in psychiatry, in psychology, but in psychoanalysis we never talk about suicide within context of death drive. But to me it seems like the parallel at least or related terms because it's both about death. So how can we say suicide relates uh, to death drive?
Yeah, I mean,
Or
I think that's a fascinating question because I know a lot of people would answer that by saying and I think maybe Lacan, I mean, I think Lacan, I know how Slavoj would answer that he would say actual suicide is a way of avoiding the repetition of death drive, right?
Mm.
And I think Lacan would probably say something like that too. Um, but I don't know about that. Like, I think that, like, I could see the way in which a certain, I mean, I think suicide is hard to generalize about because I think there's so many different motivations for it that it's hard to say, like, yeah, it's always this. But I do feel like it can be just a manifestation of death drive, like one of the manifestations. I mean, it's interesting. So this is not a psychoanalytic thinker, but Hegel thought that suicide was what was the very index of our humanity. He's like
Mhm.
he said the human is the being that kills itself. And he thought that it's a little like Freud and Beyond the Pleasure Principle. He thought like every every subject kills itself in its own way. And I think if you think about the different things that we do in relation to suicide, then that makes a little more sense. Like someone's way of killing themselves might be smoking, right? Like I had a TA once in a class and she smoked a lot and I said, you know, it's probably not that great for you. And she looked at me and she's like, well, she goes, I'm planning on quitting in a year or so. And I said, well, you'll quit one way or the other, right? Like, like there, that, and I think but okay, smoking is maybe the clearest thing, but it's true. I think everybody has their certain way. It could be like the thing, like the little guilty pleasure of eating you have, or like, sex without a condom with random people or whatever it is. I think everybody has their way of like destroy. I know I have a friend who goes parachuting, and that's like relatively safe, but it's still you're sort of increasing your death chances by doing it. So I would say everybody, and this is a Hegelian point that everybody has their way of killing themselves, and so I think someone who commits suicide, I'm almost tempted to say they just sort of ramp that up. They accelerate that process more than say someone like me. But I don't think that we're that distinct. I don't know. What do you have? I'm very curious to hear what you think about this question.
Well, with Sabina Spielrein, she would say probably that love is suicidal and having children is the less obvious one. Well, at the same time, more obvious one because she compares it with a tumor and it actually like
Right.
parasites on your body and then the rest of your life. And
Yeah,
love
yeah, yeah.
is
Yeah.
something similar. But um, with psychoanalytically, I think to maybe to stay away a little bit for a while from Zizek and this Lacanian interpretation of death drive as eternal life and then just interrupt
Yeah.
it with suicide. There are other ways to think about it within psychoanalysis that I would partially agree, like this idea that the unconscious is death driven that and suicide might be kind of when it enters conscious and it's not supposed to be and it's
Oh,
something, but I would only partially agree that we are not conscious of the death drive. I think we actually pretty much consciously don't want to live that much. It might be something kind of mega structure of unconscious, but consciously, I think we pretty much not really those survival mechanisms. There's something in us, maybe the duality of both, when it's going to end, quite consciously
yeah.
having kids or something. There
Right.
might be
Having kids for
levels.
sure. Right. I mean, that's maybe the most obvious thing. Right.
So this kind of sacrifice, there's some interesting maybe relation between death drive as unconscious mechanism that even if you are driven by pleasure it's still death drive within you. You
Yeah.
just don't know it, but pretty much I think we know it. And I think to a certain extent there's also knowing it and manifestating of it in consciously, it's what gives value. And the other thing is that I'm from Ukraine, and for us, like there is no, I don't, the subject is not the subject driven by pleasure. It's just like subject who consciously is death driven, more or less. It's not like maybe different subject from the standard death driven, the pleasure driven subject. Like no one wants in Orthodox Christianity, no one wants to enjoy in Orthodox Christianity, you just suffer and that's it. Just
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I mean, I guess um not sure if I get your point that there's I sort of am drawn to this idea that suicide maybe is when it becomes conscious, because but part of me is tempted to say, and I think you'll disagree with this, that I think the death drive is a logic that cannot become conscious. And I think if it becomes conscious, then it we turn it into a thing that we're aiming for uh, in a way that we make as something good. Like even, and I think that's why I was sort of drawn to your idea that suicide is like the point at which death drive becomes conscious, because like then you make the destruction into a good that you're going to pursue consciously, right? Like I think I'm not sure that we can think. I guess so. For, it's what's interesting to me is Freud and Lacan never, but Freud often talks about the distinction between what is conscious and what is unconscious, right? And like the different logics that govern those things. And but once he introduces the death drive, he never says like, "Oh, the death drive has to be unconscious." Like he just doesn't. But I would want to link death drive to the structure of the unconscious. Like I think that's I don't think that its logic can be uh, brought over into consciousness just because if it is, then we're turning that destruction into a good, right? Like
Mm.
I think people do that all the time, but I think it just it transforms the nature of the drive. So that's I think you're probably disagree with this, but that's the way I would see it. Like it has to be unconscious.
So conscious is something that kind of lies, we can say, and unconscious is something that doesn't lie. But um, not but when unconscious death drive becomes conscious, we would still, because maybe unconscious is negative in this sense and conscious is positive, we would give a certain positive value to anything that this negative logic,
That's my claim. That's my
like
claim.
justifying it or having certain benefit out of it. And
Yeah.
suicide from this position can be seen either as unconscious entering consciousness and you're really just not able to coexist with it, or suicide can be seen as something positive, like the you just end, it's going to be better because you'll end all the
And
suffering.
my suffering, right. I think a lot of people kill themselves for that reason, right? That they're actually it is a good that they're pursuing, right? That they, yeah, yeah,
Oh, yeah. Um, but nonetheless, the suicide is interesting, and self-harm as also the obvious kind of way of something suicidal, but only partially. It's
yeah,
a way maybe to limit it to your body or take control of it uh, through your own actions, kind of make it visible, in a way
yeah.
limit something more larger than your body, than those the harm to.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think self-harm is a way that I like what you said, like it kind of melds the pleasure principle and the death drive, because it does give you a kind of control over that destruction, right? And then that I think aligns with pleasure principle. It's a little like the way Freud describes the Fort Da game that his grandson is playing, right? Like he it is he likes to, he enjoys more the losing of the object, but nonetheless there's a kind of control he has over the loss, and so that there's some kind of pleasure attached to it. So I do think that's right. I think that self-harm can be understood in, in that way. That makes sense.
I would also prefer kind of to think about it as an act of dignity, in a way, because you limit the harm to your body, kind of the whole universal harm that is happening. Um, Not just derive, not just limiting taking control, but also the part of the, not to romanticize it, but nonetheless, it's something noble even in just doing it for yourself, limiting to yourself, than just collapsing the whole world around you. Um, but it's
Right.
a
I think that's
problematic
right.
statement.
Right. And I think it's freeing too, don't you? I mean, again, not to romanticize it, but I think like the way it can be freeing is, I think, best illustrated. Do you know that great scene in Fight Club where um, Edward Norton beats himself up in front of his boss, and like he frees himself from the control of his boss. And so I think that's a nice example, I think, of the way that it can kind of free you from this I mean, this kind of larger health imperative that controls us.
Yeah, we're so afraid to romanticize self-harm because of this psychological perspective that, but if you think about it, anything is self-harm and
Right,
self,
I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. I
like
think we're involved in self-harm all the time, every
mm,
day.
going to work, which is much appreciated.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
Right, that's probably the most harmful thing we do to ourselves. I mean, if you go to like an 8 to 5 job every day, that's what a
mm,
psychically harmful thing that is.
it's horrible.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, Including psychoanalysis and philosophy, by the way, it's a little bit better.
Yeah, yeah,
You never right, you're always in the wrong.
yeah.
And I also wanted to talk about existentialist, because we started to talk about being towards death last time, but we never actually compared the death drive and being towards death. And I know that you have interest in existentialism too. So, what can we say? What is the similarity between Heidegger's being towards death and Freud's death drive? Because both are about death, but
Yeah, I think they're so I th- I think we both have a lot of friends that think there's no similarity at all. But I think there are some similarities, and I think that I guess what I would say is death becomes an issue for us because we are subjects of the death drive. So, and which is, of course, Heidegger would never say that. But I think that like it's not so in a way if Death Drive names are, which I think it does, I wonder if you would agree with this, that Death Drive for me names are infinitude, like our ability to go to create the transcendent, to go beyond ourselves, to like our act of destroying ourselves is how we get beyond ourselves. So if it names our infinitude, I think that it brings us in touch with death because we're beyond it in a way. Not, and that's why death is for us an issue. Like Heidegger says, like we are the beings for whom death is an issue, right? And I think death is an issue for us not because we're reduced to our finitude, which is how Heidegger defines Dasein, but because and he avoids the word subject because of this idea of infinitude attached to it. Um, that I think that it's instead our infinitude that makes death a problem for us. And so I think that Death Drive shows us that in a way that is very, very fascinating. And yeah, I think that a lot should be thought about the relationship between existentialism and psychoanalysis. But the problem is that I think the major thinkers and the problem I think here's the problem that existentialism is so rooted in phenomenology and psychoanalysis, at least the way you and I think about it, is so rooted in dialectics that they cannot come together. So Sartre is like the closest they come together because he's so influenced by Hegel, but he's so he doesn't believe in the unconscious. He's so anti-psychoanalytic that I think it doesn't really work with him. So that's what I would say. Like I think that's why it's hard to bring those things together, but I think it's imperative that we do. I say this all the time, and yet haven't yet written my little book that's about existentialism and psychoanalysis because I've been preoccupied by other things. But
partially you did. But for me, it's on one hand, both terms are problematic because of this. Not both, but like Freudian, Lacanian, even Spielreinian, and interpretation of death drive or death instinct and being towards death. It's kind of partially way of avoiding actually talking about death, strangely, and talking about life. And I'm wondering if there is actual way to talk about finitude. With Sabina Spielrein, she comes closer because she talks about the creation out of destruction and trying to actually genuinely make this destruction central and creation is just something, but still it's about creation that she's talking. Death drive, especially in Lacanian interpretation, like this eternal repetition, It's not talking about death. It's like avoiding, it's saying that death is not death. And Freudian death drive, it's also how it's structural to subject who is alive, even if you say that it's, and being towards death, it's like it's still being towards, it's still, and it's like better being because it's
Well,
towards
right,
it's,
right,
it's
for sure,
more of
Heidegger.
better life than. So I'm wondering if there's actual way of talking about
Of,
death.
of thinking about death as death, right?
Death
Like,
as this, yes. But
yeah.
nonetheless, I never found it. It's, and I just witnessed that using those concepts are problematic because it's something
Yeah.
within themselves. They contradict to what they try to expose in a way. Was
Well, go ahead.
Uh, well, there is other problem that they share for me being towards death and death drive is that they are not both not social, especially in Heidegger. It's like against the not Mitsein, but the Dasman. It's something that individualizes you, uh, and it's about you, authentic individualization of Dasein, and it's against the opposite to others, to being with others. So it's not about love or anything. It's about maybe in his comprehension of care, this strange care of the being, but others are kind of away from it. But those two problems, that is not about death and it's about subject.
But could you, I guess you could think about like the death of humanity, but like, isn't death always I mean, I think Heidegger would say, isn't death, I mean, he even says being towards death individualizes Dasein down to itself. Like that's a line from Being in Time, right? So
Mhm.
my question for you would be, doesn't death always do that? So is there like a is there any such thing as a collective death? Like I
Yeah.
don't know.
So we still tend to think, even in Sabina Spielrein, when we talk about death instinct as something social, as something about love in between subject, not about subject, we still tend to, and it would be really great to learn how to talk about Spielrein without bringing Jung into discussion. But nonetheless,
Right. I know. The
Jung
problem
is.
is she was Jung's student, right? Like that's an issue.
So we think about this love, death-driven love, Spielreinian, as servicing not individual survival, but survival of larger entity of, I don't know, anything collective, other entity, which is not substantially different because it's in the interest. You sacrifice yourself to the interest of. In biology, it's still this Darwinian thinking, just not individual. It's like this logical being altruist. It just serves the species, which is still same. It's just subject entities with pleasure principle, self-interest, just larger. And
Right.
any individual would be just the sacrificing themselves individually. It's the horrible logic, which it's still the establishes pleasure principle just on a larger scale. So for me,
Absolutely true. Right. Right.
it's not death. It's still in this logic. It's not death. It's just death, smaller death, subordinating is subordinated to larger life, which is horrible. I would prefer to think about the unity, what Spielreins call we psyche, or they would sometimes translate it as that. It's not individuals. It's not the psyche of a larger entity, but it's just indifferentiated space, actually basically space of nothingness or loss. It's just not that positive entity, but just this destruction everywhere, something like it. And in Heidegger, for me, in being towards death, it would be not that it's individualization and not that it's about the individual, the out. Some people would try to, some Heideggerians would try to see authentic possibility of authentic being with others,
Yeah.
Mitsein, through the admitting death of the other. But it's not enough. It's still not admitting death, still using death for something, for some kind of
For some
authenticity, even
purpose.
if
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
death of, let's say, it's not the death of the other that is important. Not only your death is important, but death of the other. We can say the death of humanity or potential death. For me, it's still too much of this positive emphasis on out authentic or being good. It's still about you or the larger entity becoming authentic. Um, I would prefer. So I had this crazy idea of, which I really like, of thinking about the subject, which I actually take from Sabina Spielrein and from Iris Marion Young, who takes the pregnant woman as a subject instead of conventional subject in philosophy, in psychoanalysis, who is not pregnant because it's men. But nonetheless, if you think about pregnant subject, it's the subject who is doubling within, not centered on, so it's a Mitsein within Dasein, actually physically even. And in your case with twins, it's like tripling
Right, right,
subject.
right,
So it's not that self-interest, and we would interpret motherhood and the pregnancy in terms of its actual, the subjectivity that is, it's still self-interest, taking care of children is still kind of taking care of you. But no, what if it's the actually Mitsein, the in-betweenness that is created, and what would be the being towards death in relation to this subject, and as something that, I don't know, you produce something that is mortal through your own destruction, and the you value whatever you produce in your body's doubling or tripling. You value because you sacrifice, but at the same time is the extinction of you and your vulnerability. And
yep,
the horror of them being mortal is much more than the horror of you being mortal. It's
for
like
sure. Right.
much worse than it. So it's not about authentic, being authentic. No one cares about you here. And the other thing is that all the subjects in philosophy and in psychoanalysis are seen from a position of a child, basically, who needs to be separated from other, being individualized and free. But what if we take, and they're failing because they're talking, we can see that they're failing because they talk about it so much, the separation, the freedom, being individualized. But what if we talk about from a position of the mother from whom you so it's completely different thing. It's not about individualization or authenticity.
It's about law.
It's about love. It's so the being towards death would rather produce love, um, not authenticity and not individualization. It would just be responsible for not authentic love, but just love as such. You care for others. Uh, Something that structures Mitsein, not Dasein in a way,
Through sacrifice.
through sacrifice. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I like that a lot. I think that makes sense. Although you're still, isn't it? Aren't you still up against this problem that you've made death kind of serve
Mm.
something else, right?
Yeah. It's-
You know what I'm saying? Like it's like it's a social thing that it's serving, but it's still in service of something else and not death. Like not death thought as death, right?
Mhm. Well, you can say that this love is destruction, that it's not a good
I see.
thing. It's
I see.
not what you aim for. It's rather what is happening. Love can be seen as this conscious way of justifying that your own children. I'm having the children, or I don't know, extended. My existence is extended. It's just this justification. Oh, I'm a good person because I love and care for others. It's just conscious justification of the expansion of destruction and mortality, which again we end up talking about about life and extension of life and reproduction.
But
It,
what you want to say is even in reproduction, what's driving it is this experience of death, right? Like I think.
mm, for Sabina Spielrein, it would be for sure that is. And the other thing is that we can discuss the ethical side of death drive, because unlike for Freud, who in Civilization talks about it as rather opposite to ethics, for you is ethical. And I also was thinking about the ethical side of being towards death in a way. There's interesting thing that Heidegger mentions, the concept of Schuld, like in
Yeah. Yeah,
Schuldigen, the
yeah,
guilt. And the guilt is something, the voice within you that actually exposes what we would call psychoanalytically the lack. or the nullity
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
upon which the
Yeah.
Dasein is. So it's like feeling that in ultimate lack, getting in touch with the establishing loss.
I like that a lot, Julie. And I don't think it's interesting because I've read a lot of stuff on Heidegger, and I can't remember anybody ever saying that. I mean, I because when I don't know about you, when I first read Being in Time, I'm like, wait, conscience, like, isn't conscience oppressive, superegoic
Mm.
force? But for him, it's not at all, right? And I think it's because I never understood that really until you just said that, but it's because it precisely comes out of death and lack, right? Like that's why it's not, that's why for him, that call of conscience is 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 emancipatory, not oppressive, right? And I think that's really, I think that's really great reading of Heidegger. The only thing I would say about ethics and death drive, I'm very invested in that idea that, and I think it's because, and I would relate this to the way Kant talks about us as ethical beings, that to be ethical means to be lifted out of the pathological. And I guess for me, the only way that we get lifted out of the pathological is through these sacrifices that are linked to death drive. So I think it's a, like, if pathological means self-interested pursuit of the good, et cetera, then I think, well, then I just think there's a real connection between death drive and our ability to have any kind of ethical behavior at all, right?
Mm.
So I think death drive obviously can take different paths, but I think one of the paths it can take is this very ethical path.
It's easier to talk about social and ethical death drive than talk about social and ethical being towards death, because we normally use this logic for anxiety on this angst, which is really um, really separating from others. It's like you feel your shit, maybe like everything is collapsing. You feel your nullity, but it's not making you ethical in terms of it's like making you better than others, but it's not in relation to others. And this,
Right, it's not. Right.
if
And
you
I
think,
wonder even if the Heideggerian call of conscience is an ethical.
not really, because even his care is not ethical. What
Yeah, I
he
know.
is care
I know. It's
of.
kind of like you're caring about your own Dasein, right? Like I don't think it's care about, it's not care in the sense that you would talk about it, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, it's also problematic because in certain ways this Heidegger's care is better because it's care for being as such. It's not individualized into, like,
Right.
it's not separated. It's like this nothingness more.
Yeah.
And a care that we normally talk about is precise actions related to the differentiated entities in a world, like people or animals. Or so there's something interesting about him, care for nothing, kind of.
Right. It is care for nothing, I think. You know what's interesting? I just finished reading the numbers of the Black Notebooks that have come out, and Zorga or care, it drops out totally. Like there's just no, just like being towards death is gone totally. So it's interesting by the mid, so I think they start in 33 or something, like, or 32. By that time, he's just not thinking in those ways.
Mm.
It's kind of interesting.
He would still at least come back to think about nothingness. And at the end, like in his later notebooks, it feels like he's more modest because the nothingness was, it's
Yeah,
no, there's nothing grandiose anymore about individualization. It's more about insignificance of nothingness. It just,
right. Right. Unlike the early lecture, What is Metaphysics, where nothingness is so, there's a kind of grandiose, like, anxiety is what holds us out into the nothing, right? Like that idea.
mm. So we talked about death drive and being towards death, and a little bit about Lacan and Spielrein. What else you want to talk about?
I don't know. I feel like that we've kind of covered some great stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think that to me, I guess I would just say that the real, I guess probably again, I don't know who's going to do it, but the real important, I mean, I think you're going to be the real person of a rediscovery of Sabina Spielrein, which is, I think, real. I teach that essay on her essay on Death Drive like almost every semester. Like I really love it, and I think it has such incredible value for understand. I think its position right in 1912 is such a and I think again you can speak to this much better than I can. But it's such an important thing because it's almost like one of the founding texts of modernism as a movement, I think. And one of the things that I think hasn't been fully thought through is the relationship between modernism as a artistic and aesthetic development and death drive and the way that Spielrein plays such an important role in that and the way in which Freud's maybe his experience of art possibly also pushes him toward the discovery of death drive. So I feel like a lot of these, a lot of modernist artists uh, have something to contribute to our conception of death drive. I'm just thinking of Virginia Woolf off the top of my head, but I think there's be a lot that we could talk about. So that would be, I think that would be an interesting thing that you and I maybe or somebody should really try to explore because I really think that that movement is completely linked to just the moment in time itself should let us know that is linked to the discovery and exploration of death drive. But yeah, I've always as I was teaching Spielrein in the fall, I can't I that just struck me that her relationship to modern art was really uh, incredible. And this one final thing about her relationship with things. I wonder, have you thought about this, her relation to Joseph Schumpeter and this idea of creative destruction in capitalism? Like he's like that idea is still capitalist theorists still like that idea. And so and he comes up with it in like, I don't know, when is that? Like 1932 or something. I don't know, later 30s. Um, so I wonder, have you thought about like Schumpeter, the relationship, creative destruction, and Spielrein at all?
No, but first, when you mentioned that you teach her Sabina Spiel right now, that's the point where I catch cold because I saw maybe my mission is complete. Now you, and I was slightly hoping that you're doing it wrong.
Oh, you think I'm sure I'm doing it wrong. Yeah.
Hopefully. But
Yeah.
otherwise, there are so many points in her that you can link and find her valuable. Because she's not that well known and there is no established tradition of talking. There are no people who will come run to you and tell you what she said, because this is what is happening with Lacan. There is no space of freedom because someone will tell you that this is what not Lacan. This is not Lacan. Like it's important. There is no space of creativity anymore. And she,
Yeah.
because this paper is tiny, because she's offering so many points and styles of consideration, you can link it to um, various traditions and use it in various ways. I think this is what makes her amazing.
So you really think that about Lacan, huh? That you can't, it's kind of, it's just you're policed if you try to say something free and
Well,
original.
maybe not you, but I am. But I
No,
know
I
that
know.
some.
Well, we're going to find out because I just wrote the Cambridge introduction to Lacan, and it's very heterodox. So we'll see. I'm prepared to lose a lot of friends because of no. So,
Good luck with. All right. Thank you for
oh,
the
Julie, it's always great to talk to you. Thanks.
always great talking to. I will stop recording.